and welcome to another episode of my podcast, One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. I'm your hostess, Caitlin, with 20 plus years experience within sewing and 12 plus years experience within the hobby and somewhat profession of living history. This podcast explores things as historic clothing and wardrobes, myth debunking, stories and experiences from living history events, and also some about how I've incorporated things I've learned from history into my everyday 21st century life. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider following along so you're notified when new episodes are published. Last time we discussed 19th century fertility and conception advice, and this time we're going to look into dressing the 1830s baby. Really infants from birth to about 6 to 8 months old until they basically start crawling. And there is somewhat of a selfish reason that I am doing this podcast now. I have started tracing all of my original garments and making patterns. So the first 3 we are going to get up for sale very soon. And 2 of them have to do for this era. So one is the 19th century diapers pattern, which includes diapers, pilchers, diapering information, and then also nursery baskets. It's basically like a 50 plus research paper with patterns stacked onto it. And then there's also the 1825 to 1843 infants undergarments pattern, and that will be available as well. There's also an 1840s to 1860s version, but we're not really talking about that in this video. I hope to have the patterns for dresses and caps and also pattern for outerwear. Those are getting done very soon. These are currently only going to be offered as PDF patterns, but I hope by the beginning of next year to start doing paper patterns if there's a request for them. As the patterns become available, I will be putting links to the PDF patterns available for purchase in the description of this podcast if you're interested. So without any further ado, let's get started. Now obviously we can't get into all the facets of dressing an 1830s baby, but we're going to do our best. There are differences for class, ethnicity, where you are in the world, etc. For this podcast's sake, we're going to talk about American and English clothing, and we'll talk working class through leisure class today, and I'll let you know where things differ by class. Let's start by describing each article of clothing an infant might wear, and then we'll end with some literature to see the different ways an infant may be dressed so that you can what is and what is not appropriate as to the options in infants' layers. Beginning with diapers. Diapers are usually linen due to linen's absorbency and feeling soft and dry to the touch even when damp. If making diapers, it was advised by nearly every baby linen book to make them out of linen diaper cloth. Diaper is a thicker fabric, or at least thicker than a plain weave cloth, and it has designs woven into it. The thick nature of the diaper makes it ideal for diapers, or napkins as they were called in England, as they usually are again today. In fact, even by the 1820s, we already see Americans prefer to call this article the diaper, and the British call it a napkin. Earlier sources from the 18th century called them squares of diaper, so you can see where we definitely got the name diaper from. It's from the fabric name. Other options for diapers, other than linen diaper, would include something like a plain weave linen fabric, or if poor, a well-washed linen that was cut into diaper squares from old tablecloths or sheets. It was recommended to have 4 to 6 dozen diapers in your collection for baby, although for the poor, sometimes as little as 1 dozen or even a half dozen were given. I can't imagine functioning with only a half dozen diapers. You would have to constantly be doing laundry 2 to 3 times a day at least. Now, I have run across a couple of cautions in medical books against drying urine-soaked diapers by the fire and then putting them back on the baby without being properly washed, and that, of course, causes rashes. And the medical books always say this is mostly due to poverty or lazy nurses. 1829's A Treatise on the Physical and Medical Treatment of Children says, quote, "But it should be well understood when we speak of keeping the child clean that we do not consider the repeated reapplication of the same diaper, because it had been hung in the air or before a fire and dried, as coming within our direction. There can be but 2 reasons for this filthy practice, laziness and poverty. The first should never be considered a valid excuse for employing the same diaper several times, nor will it perhaps ever be urged as one, in direct terms, but it is unquestionably the only one that does influence upon the subject, whereas the second does not obtain or render this, or even in appearance, excusable. If the second reason exists, the child should have not a sufficient change. It were much better that it would be without a diaper from time to time, than have those returned to it stiffened with salts and reeking with offensive odor. We have already averted to the impropriety of keeping the child wet." End quote. A version of elimination communication, or training from infancy, for the parents to watch the baby's natural potty cues and then put it over a chamber pot was practiced very much in the 19th century, and that meant that it was very normal for a child to be without diapers at all by the ages of 4 to 8 months. So going without a diaper just meant that the parents just had to be a little bit more diligent in watching for the cues. And then for the quotes that saying only 6 diapers were given to poor women, I don't know if those mothers specifically supplemented with diapers they made in addition to the ones they were given, because the quotes of 1/2 or 1 dozen diapers were both from recommendations on what to lend to the poor at birth. So basically, it was the wealthier ladies in the community would put together a basket of needed items for the new mother, and that's where these baby linen baskets were for. So they really didn't contain very many articles because it was given in charity, and it was basically the bare minimum that could be given. Diapers in this era typically pinned with straight pins, as safety pins were not invented. If done safely, the risk of poking a child is very low. Now, the 1830s is a very interesting time because folks are starting to attach diapers with ties instead of with straight pins. The earliest reference I have found to a tied diaper I have found in 1830 is the New York Medical Inquirer, quote, "Tape should be used instead of pins for all of its coverings, even to its diapers," end quote. 1829 is a treatise on the physical and medical treatment of children. Among other late 1820s and early 1830s works, state that diapers should still be closed with pins, but that other articles should be closed with ties. Quote, "In general, nurses are in the habit of using from 8 to 12 pins for dressing of the child, a quantity much too great for even usefulness. Did no risk attached to their employment, especially as the same ends can be completely answered by 2, as is the regular practice in our own family. It is true that to render so few efficient strings or tapes must be used in their stead. The following is the mode employed. The belly band and the petticoats have strings. Not a single pin is employed in their adjustment. The little shirt, which is always made much larger than the infant's body, is folded on the back and bosom, and these folds are kept in their place by properly adjusting the body of the petticoat. So far, not a pin is used. The diaper requires one, and it should be of a large size and made to serve for double purpose of holding the folds of this article as well as keeping the belly band in its proper place, the latter having a small tag of double linen depending from its lower margin, by which is secured to the diaper by the same pin. Should an extraordinary display of the best bib and tucker be required for any special occasion, a third pin may be added. This last pin, however, is applied externally, so the risk of its getting into the child's body is very small, even though it become displaced," end quote. He goes on to stress that not only pins should be used and not needles because these are apt to work their way into the child's body and may never be found. There is apparently a 1798 case where a child became seriously ill. After months, it was found that there was a 2-inch needle in his thigh, presumably, but at least by the doctor, being from where it was used as a pin. The needle was removed and the child enjoyed a happy life, with the parents insisting they had no earthly idea how the needle came to get lodged in the child's thigh. Diapers were usually rectangular, twice as long as they are wide, hemmed all the way around by hand, and then folded to wear. The first fold would be to form a square, and the 2 opposite corners would be folded to form a triangle, on which was laid baby, and all the points were wrapped up and around baby to be pinned or tied in front. The Workman's Guide of 1838 has diapers being cut 22.5 inches by 45 inches, and the only other dimension for baby diapers that I have found was from a 1780 source, which called for the diapers to be 19.25 inches by 43.5 inches, which makes them not quite square, but it allowed for no fabric wastage, which was very important in the 18th century. The Workman's Guide is also the first time I have seen a second type of diaper, the one where the rectangular is sewn together, right sides together, and then turned right side out already into the square. I have not found this option earlier than 1838, but it is great for late 1830s. The advantage of the old way, however, is that after being used for diapers, they are the same size and shape as mid-19th century towels, and they can be used as such for cleaning and thus extending their use. Over the diaper, we have the pilcher, or pilch, or flannel square, flannel napkin, flannel diaper, or square of flannel, depending on who you ask and what source we're looking at. Now, this is an optional layer. It is not usually listed in the baskets that are lent to the poor, but this is a square of wool flannel, or sometimes a triangle. By 1838, it's a triangle. And this must be wool flannel, not cotton flannel was not a thing yet, and the color is usually off-white or buff. Again, these are totally optional. The Workwoman's Guide of 1838 has them being cut into a triangle with a little linen waistband that buttons in front. The earlier sources are just a square of flannel about 31.5 inches around that are folded in half to form a triangle and then pinned on like a diaper, and they do go over the linen diaper. These are only seen as necessary if you are not as diligent in watching for baby's toilet cues and need the diaper to actually hold urine instead of just wetting the other clothes, because the linen, it would just seep through into other clothes. This is a way to actually keep it somewhat water resistant or liquid resistant, not necessarily waterproof, but liquid resistant, we'll say. For living historians who wish to continue the use of modern cloth or disposable diapers, these wool flannel covers do make excellent period diaper covers for modern diapers. When a child is toilet trained, about 6 months or so, a diaper would be left off and the pilcher would be replaced with drawers. These drawers were split crotched but closed in the front and back with a button, which could be undone for potty purposes. The drawers were kept on by infants with straps, or even a little bodice stay, generally corded, but not always. Our next garment would be a belly band or a flannel band, bandage, or even a roller if you want to use the old-fashioned by 1830s word. These are usually only worn in the 1830s from newborn to about 6 to 12 months of age in England and just for a few months of age in America. Most usually they are a plain, flat, rectangular strip of wool flannel, 4 to 6 inches wide, and to either wrap around once around the baby, which would be 18 to 25 inches, or they could wrap around twice and then they are going to be 36 to 40 inches long. To finish them, what you do is you fold over the flannel edge once towards the front of the garment, so not towards the back where you usually put a hem, you put it on the right side, and use a decorative herringbone stitch with a silk or linen floss in a herringbone stitch just all the way around the edge. This is both practical and pretty. Having the hem towards the outside and covered with decorative stitching means that there is no hem that might possibly irritate baby's skin, but instead a smooth length of fabric goes against baby. By the 1830s, it is recommended that they tie shut, but extant still show a variety of belly bands that do pin, with no closures, meaning that they were pinned shut. Some sources recommend a linen belly band underneath the flannel, especially if the infant's skin is particularly sensitive, but otherwise the fuzzy warmth of the flannel was considered healthful for babies. The belly band was particularly important in the first few weeks of life when the baby's umbilical stump was still attached. If irritated, the site could get infected or hemorrhage, which of course could be life-threatening in the 19th century. Therefore, having a soft band around the site constantly is very protective. In the warmer American climate, you see recommendations to leave off the belly band as soon as the infant's umbilical site has not only fallen off, but completely healed, usually between 6 and 10 weeks of age. In England, you see more recommendations for the belly band to be left on longer, even up to a year of age. Just a few decades prior, a baby would wear a linen bandage first, and then a flannel one over top. But I don't see that recommendation in the 30s as much, unless of course the infant is having skin sensitivities to the wool flannel. And now we get to shirts. Shirts should be white and they are generally made of soft linen, but a white cotton, known as calico in the period, or even a cotton linen blend would be appropriate. Shirts for infants typically open all the way down the front, so they are very much adjustable. You heard in the previous quote where they would just wrap around if it was too big. No closures are used, instead the shirts are again held shut with subsequent layers and petticoats. The Workman's Guide, again 1838, has a great pattern for 1820s and 1830s infant shirts, of which I own a nearly identical original. These are usually very simply made with narrow hemming, and typically they have the sleeves set in like a shift. The little tiny mini gusset and all those gussets are sometimes only like an inch wide. They are super cute and also very annoying to sew in. Sleeves are typically short, unlike the previous century where longer sleeve shifts would be common. And these sleeves are often left plain, although sometimes a bit of lace or a little handwork, whitework embroidery would not be out of place on the sleeves. These shirts create almost no waste in the making, and they are very economical in their design and make. They're generally a single strip of fabric that you fold in half so that the raw edges are in the middle, and you have two sides with folds, and you make some slits for the shoulders, and you slit down the fold a little bit for the sleeves. The top part of the shoulder is just run and filled. You put the sleeve and gusset in, it's run and filled. There's no other side seams because that's on the fold. The rest of it is entirely hemmed. It's all in one fell swoop. You just hem it all the way around in one seam. And then the top parts that we cut the slit from for the shoulder, those are just flaps and they just kind of fold down. They can go fold. I've seen some originals that fold inward and I have some that fold outward. So that appears to be personal preference. Shirts for infants work very much like the adult shirt or shift or chemise would. It is a base layer that gets laundered much more frequently than the other layers and is the first line of defense against sweat, body oils, urine, and feces blowouts, etc. It is recommended to make shirts from soft linen. It is best to use old, well-washed linen for this purpose, as linen is distinctive due to its becoming stronger, softer, and more absorbent as it is used and washed. For the poorer classes, soft calico can be used instead, and if the child is delicate, it is recommended in the advice to mothers on the management of their children that a flannel shirt be used for extra warmth. And next we have flannels, which is a very general term for most of the articles that are made of flannel. Most generally, you would also include the pilcher and the belly band within flannels, but also sometimes the flannels specifically refer to the petticoats made out of flannel. So by the 1830s, a flannel bed or blanket, which is essentially a very large flannel square that is wrapped around baby and tied around, but that is mostly out by the 1830s and replaced by flannel petticoats except for nighttime. The latest reference I have to a bed or blanket for babies for day wear would be from the American Farmer, which is 1827. However, I can find references to them being used for sleepwear until 1837. So instead of a bed for day wear, flannel petticoats would be worn. The very basic petticoat is almost still like a blanket. The most simple style is literally a rectangle of fabric with U's cut out for the armholes, and then it's bound all the way around, and you use some of the binding to create shoulder straps, and this would tie on usually in the front. Another simple style of flannel petticoat for day or night wear, especially for babies that are less than 2 months old, would be a wrap petticoat with a flannel skirt and a flannel bodice that is lined with soft calico or linen. This also tied shut and was a very popular style, seeing as you see it well into the beginning of the 20th century. For most babies, a flannel coat or bodice coat consisting of a flannel, and remember that flannel means wool flannel, skirt with a linen or twill bodice, which may or may not be lightly corded for support. That would be those typical type of petticoat, and they call them flannel coats or sometimes bodice coats. All of these flannel petticoat styles tie in the back. It was very much stressed that infants would be kept warm, so flannel petticoats would have been considered absolutely necessary except in the hottest of climates. A normal but somewhat optional layer would then be petticoats. These for very young infants would mostly be made out of a very fine cotton, and they would be bodiced or have a top to them as well with shoulder straps and sleeves. Because young children are generally rectangles with appendages, there are rarely hips on which to set a waistband, so petticoats would then hang from the shoulder, similar to how we saw drawers earlier hang from the shoulders. Petticoats can be very simple affairs in a very similar style to a bodice coat as described before, just cotton skirt instead of flannel, or they could be full dresses with like little puff sleeves and everything. Petticoats could also be made with a waistband, but then a separate stay or bodice would be made, and that would tie or lace shut and often be corded, and they would have shoulder straps as well. And then on the bottom of those stays, buttons would be placed, at least in the center front, the sides, and on either side of the back, at the very least. So you would have at least 5 buttons. And then the petticoat, without a bodice, would have 5 buttonholes to correspond, and you would just button the petticoat onto the stays. It is a lot more work that way. However, you don't want a whole lot of bulk up here. So if you want more petticoats on the baby to keep their feet warm, you can put 2 to 3 petticoats on a stay, whereas if you did a bodice petticoat, you'd have to put more layers even on their chest, which sometimes isn't desired. So they both have their pros and cons. These cotton petticoats are going to be mentioned less frequently, and they are much less important than a flannel petticoat, and they are not always mentioned in dressing infants. There was a great movement, so to speak, on children's clothing, allowing children to move freely and be free and not be cumbered down with unnecessary clothing. This cotton petticoat was seen as superfluous and not always worn. Petticoats could range in length from a few inches below the feet for very poor baby's outfit, about 30 inches long from waist to hem for working class folks, and upwards of a yard or more in length for wealthier babies. And finally, we get to gowns. Gowns in the 1830s are very simple. The skirts are rectangles that have a slit in the back, and they are attached to the bodice, which again is a rectangle with U's cut out for the armholes and maybe a bit of shaping at the neck. Bodices can be very full and gathered, or they can be made plain with insertion work being placed in the center front. The waists are a bit higher than the natural waist, and these are often have 1 to 1.5 inch waistbands. Again, the end of the waistband should reach just above the natural waist. Sleeves tend to be very full, and they mirror women's fashions. Short, very full puff sleeves are popular, sometimes with a little V cut out at the bottom and at the top, and then they would be gathered into a band. Those bands can be embroidered with white work as well. For a longer sleeve, a gigot sleeve, much like a scaled down version of a woman's gigot sleeve with a very full top and narrow forearm, would be worn. Skirts in this era are typically very long for at least 27 inches in length and well over a yard long for wealthier classes. White cotton is going to be the most popular color for gowns of all classes, but the very poorest, destitute families may choose a print so that print will hide the lack of laundering and the dirt and grossness. Gowns close up the back, and they be worn an inch or 2 longer than the topmost petticoat. Caps for infants are starting to be laid off now that there is a new prevailing thought that infants need to keep their head cool and not as warm as previously proposed. Very fine linen or cotton day caps, highly embroidered with white work, could be worn if desired, but caps could also be left off. Multiple caps are not worn by this era by the vast majority of folks. Flannel caps may be worn right after bathing to keep from catching cold or when it's extremely cold out. Caps may tie under the chin or not have a tie at all. And they are an excellent way to show off some white work skills, fine laces, and ruffles if you choose to use them. Now let's talk shawls and receivers. A receiver is a flannel shawl anywhere from 24 to 72 inches wide as a square and lined with soft linen. These are usually bound with the wool flannel at the edges. These receivers were used to place the baby in directly after birth prior to being washed and dressed. These may afterwards be used by poorer families as a shawl in which to carry baby about, like a baby blanket. A shawl was usually much the same as a receiver, except it is not lined, and in addition to flannel, a shawl may be made in just about any soft wool, such as kerseymere or merino. They can be bound with white silk satin, or they may be hemmed with self fabric and then braided around, or else worked around the edge with silk embroidered scallops and designs in the corners. Shawls were used by nurses and by parents to carry babies and to keep them warm, but also to sit with them in the parlor to receive visitors who came to meet the little stranger. Other outerwear would include cloaks and pelisses and hoods. Cloaks and pelisses are basically the same article, but pelisses have sleeves and cloaks may or may not have slits for the arms, but they don't have sleeves. Cloaks and pelisses usually came down to at least cover past the feet, but they could be up to 1.25 yards long. An attached cape made of the same material was very common. Are generally made of wool lined with silk, but occasionally they were lined in a printed cotton. It was normal to have some sort of wrap to wear even when going outside in the summer, so unlined summer cloaks and pelisses that were made of a very sheer, fine fabric were also made. Cloaks and pelisses could be decorated with silk piping of the same fabric as the lining, or with a facing or binding of silk as well. Hoods could be made to match the cloak or pelisse, or they could be contrasting depending on the parents' wishes. A popular hood was one that had whalebone strips on the inside that could be let out as the child grows. So when the child was small, it's a very full shirred cap, so it has all those ruffles in it, and you can let out the whalebone strips to the side to make it grow with the baby. These are often lined and sometimes faced with silk, and the outer parts are generally of wool. Silk ties would close the hoods. The Workman's Guide of 1838 states that a round rosette of silk satin ribbon would be worn on the left side if the baby were a boy, and a small silk satin ribbon bow should be on the back of the hood if the baby was a girl. And now is a very good time to mention, because I did not mention before, when I say babies and infants, we're talking babies of both genders. So infants were dressed unisex until at least toddlerhood. You don't see differences in the clothing, and this makes a lot of sense in an era where there isn't an ultrasound and there's no way to really know what you're having until it literally pops out, and by then you should already have the clothes done. And in an era where you're doing everything by hand because there are no sewing machines yet, making 2 entirely different sets of clothing for a child when you only use one set of clothing is not the wisest use of time. So infants are dressed completely unisex. They are wearing all the same layers. Yes, the little boys wore dresses and petticoats. That was absolutely a thing well into toddlerhood and even boyhood. You sometimes see boys wearing still skirted tunics until they are 6-7 years old. The whole breeching ceremony was kind of a big thing for boys when they got to finally be put into pants like little men. But some families kept their boys into dresses and skirted tunics for a very long time. Even though by toddlerhood, generally there are some differences, because a lot of these things that we're talking about today, again, we're talking from birth to about 6 to 8 months until they start crawling. But still, babies wear the same clothes as the other gender until they are about 2. So the first set of clothing really is the first size, and it's going to be super long. And then once they start crawling, you shorten them, and that's going to be a whole nother video with shortening babies. Is going to have to be its own thing. But it's the same layers, they're just made shorter, about ankle length in this time period. And then that second size of clothing should be worn by that same child till about 2 years of age. So we're making 2 wardrobes for the first 2 years of life, which is very economical. These outfits are made to expand as baby grows. You put in a lot of growth tucks so that you can lengthen it as baby grows. And it's just very economical. It's very economical, and it's a very good use of fabric and time when you're having to do everything by hand. If when you're pregnant, you don't have early pregnancy tests, You're learning that you're pregnant probably around 2 or 3. You're almost in the second trimester already. Heaven forbid that baby come early, because you don't have very much time. You have like 6-7 months at the most to create this entire wardrobe for this tiny little stranger. And then when baby is born, you have at least 6 to 8 months, about the same amount of time, to make the wardrobe for the next year or so. And at that point, that's when babies start being gendered about the age of 2 with their clothes. At that point, you know what you're having, and it's a little bit easier to start gendering things. So it's a very practical thing as well. Let's go back to our clothes. We'll go to baby socks. Baby socks go up to the knee, and they were generally made of wool, but they could be made of cotton. Pink, blue, and white were very popular colors for socks. Socks and stockings by this time could be easily and cheaply store-bought, but patterns were still published if a friend, parent, or older sibling wished to spend their time making something for the baby. Shoes are generally not worn until baby starts walking and crawling. They are considered unhealthful. Bibs are totally possible for babies who have begun cutting their teeth. They are made of 2 to 4 layers of linen diaper and then tied with a ribbon around the neck after the neckline of the bib has been hollowed out. Very tiny infants generally did not wear pinafores. Once they are teething, a bib could be worn, and then once the child begins to move about, pinafore will be wanted to keep the child's clothes clean. For nightwear in 1830s, infant wears, of course, a diaper and a flannel napkin if they're going to be used. Then a shirt, a bed or blanket of flannel as described earlier, or another sort of flannel petticoat, and then a nightgown. Nightgowns, again, are very long, similar to how dresses are very long, up to 3/4 of a yard, and they are typically made to tie around the waist for fitting. The sleeves are going to be generally very long. There are very simple bedgown styles with sleeves and the night dress cut as one. And then there are fancier versions with white work insertion and then little gigot sleeves that are set in. And then when necessary, a baby may wear a nightcap as well. So let's talk about dressing a baby. So with all the things, there's so many options. The tried and true normal way of dressing an 1830s baby would be to put on a diaper, pilcher, shirt, flannel wrap petticoat, diaper, pilcher, belly band if the child is still using one, shirt, flannel wrap petticoat, cotton petticoat dress, and cap. Of course, adding on hoods and pleases and cloaks as necessary for the weather. Other writers had different opinions on what a child should wear, although we don't know whether mothers followed their unusual advice. Considering the previous way of dressing an infant prevailed well into the turn of the century, I'd say not. The Female's Friend and General Domestic Advisor in 1837 says a child's wardrobe should consist of, quote, with regards to the child's dress in the day, let it be a shirt, a petticoat of fine flannel 2 or 3 inches longer than the child's feet, with a dimity top, commonly called a bodice coat, to tie behind. Over this put a robe or frock, or whatever may be convenient, provided it is fashioned behind and not much longer than the child's feet, so that his motions may be strictly observed. Caps may be worn till the hair is sufficiently grown, but by no means till the child has got most of his teeth. The dress for the night may be a shirt, a blanket to tie on, and a thin gown to tie over the blanket, end quote. So here the author states a very similar to the normal way of dressing, but it omits the cotton petticoat and also makes the skirts just barely longer than the baby's feet. The American Farmer of 1827 requires even less clothing. It says, quote, all that a child requires in regards to clothing for the first month of its existence is a simple covering of the trunk and extremities of the body of a material soft and agreeable to the skin, and which can retain in equal degree the animal perfection in fine flannel. And I recommend that a square piece of flannel large enough to involve fully and overlapping the whole of the babe with the exception of the head, for which reasons, which I shall presently state, should be left totally uncovered. This wrapper should be fixed by a button near the breast and left so loose as to permit the arms and legs to be freely stretched and moved about in every direction. It should be succeeded by a loose flannel gown with sleeves which should be worn until the end of the second month, after which this may be changed to the common clothing of children born at this age, end quote. So this is more about dressing infants very loosely for the first 6 to 8 weeks of life, and then going back to what I said was normal before. 1828's Plain Observations on the Management of Children During the First Month has excellent directions for how to easily dress an infant, even with all the layers, without any fuss or undue necessary frustration on yourself or the child. Quote, in proceeding to speak of dressing the infant, it may be observed that greatly as the plan of making the clothes has improved in the last 20 years, still further improvement is yet desirable and possible. Mr. Hayden, from whose practical observations on the management of infants, the author will borrow several extracts, very judiciously remarks that all the clothes should be made to open behind. By this method, the shirt flannel coat, which should be made with a flannel body or stay, and gown, may be put on by one movement, exactly as a pinafore is put behind, provided the dress is properly arranged beforehand and the sleeves and armholes are sufficiently roomy to easily admit the fingers of the nurse. In this case, the arms may be put into sleeves all at once, but should the nurse not think herself sufficiently dexterous to be able to form this well, all may be put on succession without moving the body of the child. It should then be gently turned onto its stomach and the flannel belly band be first placed smooth and tied, then the shirt wrapped over, then the other clothes fastened by strings or buttons. Care must be taken that neither the strings of the cap nor the waist are tied tight, as nurses are much inclined to fall into this habit in order to make the child look neat. By this method of proceeding, the child is neither frightened nor fatigued, and if now laid down quietly, will generally sleep for some hours." End quote. Essentially, put on the diaper and the pilcher, then the belly band, but all other articles should be set one inside the other, like a little nesting doll of flannel and fabric, and so that all in one motion, the clothes may be put on over baby's head and then tied him back with little fuss and movement. Before we end today, I want to discuss what would be in a baby's wardrobe. What was an expectant mother collecting as far as clothing for her expected little one? Now, there are some differing ideas of this, of course, and I have found a few written examples from the period. Beginning with the absolute poorest, if you were receiving a charity box of baby clothing, it was recommended to give out 3 shirts, 3 caps, 1 flannel cap, 2 flannel belly bands, 3 nightgowns, 2 flannel gowns, a dozen diapers, and 2 towels for washing, and a receiver. So that was basically the bare minimum for an extremely poor family relying on charity. The 1830 report from the Report and Provisional Committee in the Metropolitan Female Asylum includes sets of baby linen that could be purchased from the inmates of the asylum for 15 shillings a set. A mother may purchase as many sets as she would like, and by no means is this everything a mother would buy or accumulate. It's just what the asylum was selling as sort of a bundle. It included 3 lawn shirts, 3 lawn caps, 3 dresses, 2 flannel petticoats, and half a dozen diapers. 1825's domestic duties is a bit early, but it does list what is in a baby's layette, which is a very modern term. A set of baby linen or just baby linen would be the more common term. The book explicitly states that most people get about a dozen of each article, but the author believes that 8 should be just fine for the average person. Therefore, the set, she thinks, should include 8 shirts, 8 nightcaps, 4 flannel petticoats for day wear, 4 flannel petticoats for night wear, 8 calico gowns, and 6 dozen diapers. Besides these articles, day caps, robes, mantles, and petticoats are to be provided at the expense of the parent's taste and pocketbook. Robe is just a fancy term for dress, and mantles are essentially another word for please. The Workman's Guide has the most extensive list of articles to be bought or made, but can't be said to be made for only wealthy people, as the author writes mostly for families that are having to make up their own clothes due to budgetary restraints. She merely states that this is the average number of articles provided by ladies for an infant's wardrobe. It consists of 12 to 18 shirts, 2 to 4 belly bands, 2 to 3 flannel caps, 6 to 12 nightgowns, 6 to 12 nightcaps, 3 to 6 day caps, 4 to 6 dozen diapers, 4 to 6 pilchers, 6 to 12 pinafores, 4 to 6 are what are called bedgowns or nightgowns, 1 to 2 flannel cloaks, 2 to 3 flannel shawls, 4 to 6 robes or day dresses, 4 to 6 petticoats, and 4 to 8 pairs of socks, 1 hood, and 1 cloak or pelisse. So there's quite a variety of what an infant's wardrobe would look like in the 1830s as far as the number of articles provided. And it sounds like a lot, but remember these are so adjustable that nearly all of them are going to be worn from newborn to at least 6 to 8 months of age, if not longer. But the dresses at least can be cut down if you desired it, and you wouldn't even have to make that second set of clothing. So that will just about wrap up this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. Thank you so much for listening to my current research on dressing the 1830s baby. I had a lot of fun researching for this, and I look forward to doing more. Next episode, we'll be looking into wedding trousseaux of the mid-19th century. So be on the lookout for that episode in the coming weeks. If you have any questions or comments, you can find me on YouTube or Instagram under Caitlin Kearns. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. And if you did, please leave a review on Spotify or a comment on YouTube and share this episode with your friends. Also, please don't hesitate to tell me what topics you would like me to cover in future episodes. Have a fantastic day, and I'll see you back here in the next episode.